Hey everybody, welcome back to the Judaism iceberg chart. This is part 7 of a series. Make sure to check out parts 1 through 6. They're also on the channel. And with that introduction out of the way, let's get straight into it. Layer 43. The Death of the Dream Teller. Dreams are a lengthy discussion, particularly in the first book of the Talmud, where it gives an entire list as to how to properly interpret dreams and different symbolisms or meanings that you can interpret based on what you see in said dreams. It's a lengthy topic, but it kind of goes back and forth on the legitimacy one should lend to a dream, as in some places it seems to lend credence to there being significance in certain imagery in dreams, while in other places it says that basically dreams should just be entirely disregarded, as there's nearly nothing that could be gained from them that's worthwhile, at least. Anyways, then the Talmud goes and relates a story of particular note, wherein there was a man by the name of Bar Hadaya, whose profession was to be a professional dream interpreter. So what happened was, there was these two sages who had identical dreams, and they both approached this man, the dream interpreter, in order to have their dreams interpreted. The thing was, the first rabbi paid him a fee, and the second rabbi didn't pay him anything, and asked for him to do it for free. So, the two of them had similar dreams. The first one that's quoted is that they saw the verse in the Torah, which states about an ox being slain before your eyes and not being able to eat. The person who paid had his dream interpreted that his business would soon make so much profit that he'd be so glad that he'd be unable to eat, versus the person who didn't pay, whose dream was interpreted that his business would be lost, and he'll be extremely sad and thereby unable to eat. A while later, they both returned separately, each with the same dream again, but this time the dream was another verse about them having multiple sons and daughters, but them being taken into captivity. So, to the one who paid him a large sum of money, he said that this was a metaphor for the fact that he'll have lots of children, and they'll all get married, so that way it'll seem to you like they're being taken into another person's home, that kind of idea. As opposed to the other one, who he said that his wife would die and that he would remarry and his children would feel like they were taken captive into another family's home. Anyways, this repeated over and over again, with them both separately coming with the same dreams and them both having their dreams be interpreted. The one who paid would have his dream interpreted positively, and the one who refused to pay had his dream interpreted negatively. Thing was, the interpretations of the dreams kept on basically coming true. The person who was interpreted for good kept on becoming increasingly successful, and his family was doing well, and he had a good job and things were happening in a positive light, as opposed to the person who had his dreams interpreted negatively kept on having bad things happen to him. He lost his business, had family troubles, got into some issues with the ruling class, and was just generally not having a great time. Anyways, this repeated until the person who didn't pay just kept on coming to the dream teller on his own. It says, he came to him and he said that I saw the outer door of my house fall. So the dream teller told him, your wife will die, as she is the one who protects the house. The rabbi said, I saw my front and back teeth fall out. He said, your sons and daughters will die. The rabbi said to him, I saw two doves which were flying. And the man said to him, that you will divorce two women. The rabbi said, I saw two turnip heads, and he said to him that you will receive 2 blows from a club. And in fact, later on in that day, the rabbi went to his study hall, and he saw that there were 2 blind people fighting each other. And he went to stop the fight, and the 2 blind men mistakenly struck him with their sticks. Thereby, the interpretation of the dream came true. So the rabbi decided that enough was enough, so he went to the dream teller and decided to pay him this time. So this time the rabbi said, I saw my wall fall in a dream, and he said, you will acquire property without limits. He said, I saw a different rabbi's house fall, and its dust covered me. And the dream teller said, that rabbi will die, and his school will go to you. The rabbi said that he saw his own house fall, and everyone came and took the bricks. The dream teller told him that this meant that his teachings will be disseminated throughout the world. Anyways, now that the rabbi was paying the dream teller, the dreams that he came to him with were all interpreted for good, over and over again. So, one time, after the dream teller left, the rabbi noticed a book fall out of his pocket. So he picked it up and saw it was the book which tells people how to interpret dreams. So he opened it up and read it, and it said therein, all dreams follow according to their interpretation, which is apparently how dream interpretation really works. And apparently this man's scheme was that if somebody paid him, he would interpret their dreams for good, thereby their result would be for good. And if they didn't pay him sufficiently, then he would interpret their dream for bad, thereby causing bad to happen to them. So the rabbi confronted him and got pretty upset, at which point the guy decided he would go into seclusion in order to do recompense, which apparently can be done by going into exile for a period. But apparently he didn't learn from his ways, and when he was approached by a Roman servant who was in charge of the king's wardrobe, who asked him to interpret his dream wherein he saw a needle pierce his finger, he demanded that the man pay him, and the man of course refused. So he decided to be nice and just not interpret the dream at all. But then the next day, the Roman came to him and said that he saw a worm which was eating his fingers. So the dream teller decided once again to demand payment. The guy refused, and he just said nothing again. And finally, once again, on the third day, the man said that he saw a worm eating his entire hand, at which point the dream interpreter said that meant that a worm came and ate all of the silk garments of the king. So he went to check, and apparently a worm had eaten all of the silk garments of the king. So the man was taken to be executed, but he decided to blame the dream teller instead. At which point they arrested the dream teller and, quote, they tied 2 cedar trees together with a rope and tied one of his legs to one cedar and one of his legs to the other cedar, and then they released the rope until his head split open. Each tree went back and stood in its place, and Bar Hadaya, the dream teller, split open and fell completely in two. Printing a Tanya in North Korea. This one's a bit of a joke one, truth be told. There's an old custom to try and print a copy of the book, the Tanya, in every language and country in order to make the teachings of Hasidus, particularly with this one book, as it's like the fundamental Hasidus and Kabbalah book, available all over the world for everyone, which has largely been successful as it's printed in nearly every language and all over the world. However, there is a particular custom to try and print a copy of the Tanya at least once in every country, and so far as I know, no one's ever printed a Tanya in North Korea, so someone should probably get on top of that. Oh, and I don't think there's a Chabad house in North Korea either, so I guess that should be set up too by somebody. He who serves and he who does not. Speaking of the Tanya, there's a very important concept illustrated in chapter 15, which essentially explains how in some places in the Torah people are described as somebody who serves God, and in other places it uses the terminology as one who does not serve God. So it explains the difference between the two, as essentially the difference between somebody who works hard and somebody who does not work hard. Meaning somebody who doesn't do very much, but he's putting in a lot of effort, and the little bit that he does is a tremendous struggle for him, then that's described as one who serves God, as opposed to somebody who does a lot, but only what's easy for him and never bothers to try and increase that in regards to an area where it would actually be difficult for him. So this person's called one who does not serve God. Essentially stating that it's really not a matter of who's more religious and who's, checking off more boxes and doing the right thing. It's about how much effort you're putting in. And if you're putting in a lot of effort comparable to your level, even if it's not very much, then that's more greatly valued than somebody who does a lot, which is what's expected of them and is not trying to do any more than they could be. There's nothing new under the sun. There's a famous saying from the book of Ecclesiastes, or Koheles in Hebrew, wherein it states that there is nothing new under the sun, and this becomes a bit of an argument between a rabbi and one of his students in the Talmud. They're speaking about the times of Mashiach, and Rabban Gamliel, the sage, states that in the world to come, a woman will be able to give birth every single day, based off of a verse in the Torah. So a certain student scoffed at him and said the verse from Koheles that there is nothing new under the sun, so how could this be a thing if there can't ever be anything new? So the rabbi took him outside and showed him a chicken which lays eggs every day, saying that clearly this is actually a concept, and it's not new, so to speak. Furthermore, the rabbi said that trees will produce fruits every single day by the time of Mashiach, and once again the student scoffed at him, saying the verse, "There's nothing new under the sun, how is this possible?" So he took him outside and showed him a caper bush, which apparently is edible during each season of the year. Furthermore, the rabbi explained, based off of a verse, that in the times of Mashiach, the land of Israel will produce cakes and wool garments that will grow in the ground, once again based off of a verse. So the student again challenged him, there's nothing new under the sun, how is this possible? So the rabbi took him outside and showed him truffles and mushrooms, which I guess are comparable to those things because they're a food which grows overnight. And as for the garments, he showed him a heart of palm, which is coated in a thin net-like covering and grows very fast. So yeah, that's the argument, and it's moderately interesting and further illustrates some of the things which will occur during the times of Mashiach. Layer 44. Prayer for Lost Objects. There is a fairly prominent sage within modern times, at least the past 100 years or so, whose name was Rabbi Meir, who was called Rabbi Meir Balanes for his proficiency in doing miracles for people and whatnot. So there is an old tradition, which is, I'm not sure exactly how it started, but if you have a lost object specifically, then you say a little prayer which mentions this rabbi's name, saying that in his merit you should find it, and you give a bit to charity, and then hopefully you'll find the object. So it's a bit of an interesting custom. I'm not entirely sure the correlation between lost objects and this rabbi, but that's the idea. Job isn't fully real. So one of the more controversial stories of the Torah is the story of Job, or Eve, wherein God kind of gets challenged by the Satan about this one particular guy who is apparently exceptionally righteous, about whether he could continue doing as he did if his life was filled with struggles as opposed to his relatively good life. So the Talmud gets into a lengthy discussion about it, and it actually states in one source that significant portions of the story are not literal and are actually just metaphor. So I guess if you take issue with the story, then there you go. Most of it didn't actually happen literally. The death of Asov. Asov is one of the most important characters in the entirety of the Torah, being, in a sense, the central villain, so to speak, of nearly a quarter of the entirety of the book of Bereshis, although his death, for some reason, is never mentioned. So you're going to have to look to the commentaries for this one, because his death is actually pretty interesting. Basically, the story mostly focuses around Maras HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, which still exists, which is the burial place of Adam and Eve, or Chava, and the forefathers, Avram and his wife, Yitzchak and his wife, and soon-to-be Yaakov. So the funeral procession was heading to bury Yaakov in his plot, when all of a sudden Asov, his twin brother, ran up and claimed that it was part of his inheritance that he should be buried in that last remaining spot, as he claimed that Yaakov had already taken his share when he buried his second wife Leah in the cave. So they got into a bit of an argument, Yaakov's sons and Asov that is, and they decided to go fetch the deed. But the deed was back in Egypt, and they were in Israel. So they sent Naphtali, who was one of Yaakov's sons and the leader of one of the 12 tribes, to run to Egypt and go fetch it. Now, it describes Naphtali as being incredibly quick. He's compared to a gazelle. It's his sigil and the animal on his banners. So I don't know how fast Naphtali himself would have to be to sprint across the entirety of the Sinai Desert from Israel to Egypt in a few hours, presumably, but the 12 sons of Yaakov are frequently explained in the commentaries to have near superhuman capabilities. One of them was said in an argument with the Egyptian royalty back when they were arguing over the whole situation with Yosef, and that was the whole thing, to punch the walls of whichever palace they were in, causing a massive earthquake and nearly knocking down the entire tower. Also, simply, in the Torah, 2 of the sons of Yaakov, particularly Shimon and Levi, killed an entire city of people in one day. So there's that, and I guess tossing someone having super speed into the list isn't too far off, particularly when Kfitzas Haderech, which can basically just be simplified into being godly fast travel, is a thing too. But turns out that was all irrelevant, because while this whole argument was happening, there was this one kid by the name of Choshim, who was the deaf son of Dun, who was one of the other of the 12 sons, asked what was going on because he was deaf, and found out that Asov was halting the funeral of his grandfather, which he was pretty upset by. So he drew his sword and cut off Asov's head, which then rolled into the cave of Machpelah, and then came to rest on Yitzchak's lap. It also mentions that at this moment Yaakov's corpse smiled, which is kind of strange, but there you have it. Adam was folded in half. Adam, according to the commentaries, was giant. Literally, like he was an actual giant. Like in one source, it says that he was initially created, he stretched from one end of the heavens until the other, which is pretty big. But by the sin of the tree of knowledge, he was shrunk down to about 100 cubits, which is still absolutely massive. Anyways, Adam and his wife Chava, or Eve, were buried in Maras HaMachpelah, the cave that was just mentioned before, the cave in Israel that you can actually visit today, along with the forefathers, their wives, and apparently the head of Asov. Maras HaMachpelah in Hebrew means the cave of doubles, and there are a few explanations given as to why, the main obvious ones being that the forefathers and their wives, meaning pairs of couples, were buried there. However, there's an additional reason given, which is that Adam, due to his absolutely enormous stature, had to be folded in half when he was buried. So if you were to go to the cave and dig him up, then you'd probably find a giant skeleton, maybe folded in half. Although he might not actually be a skeleton, which is a whole other thing, as cited by other sources, that the bodies of righteous people don't decay, and also I do not recommend digging him up because that is illegal. Layer 45. Things created before the world. So, in addition to the things created after the 6 days of creation, which is a different thing which was way earlier on, it says in the Talmud that there was a list of things which were created before the 6 days of creation, and the list is as follows. It says, quote, 7 things were created before the world was created, and they are Torah and repentance, and the Garden of Eden, and Gehenna, which is hell, and the throne of glory, and the temple, and the name of the Messiah. Then it goes and cites a bunch of sources for this, and then gets into a little bit of a conversation about how Gehenna, hell, that is, could be created if fire was only created on Saturday. So then it says that the void of hell was created before the world, but the fire for it was only created after the 7th day. How to kill a demon. The Talmud discusses demons every once in a while, and also in one part gets into a bit of a discussion on how to kill them. So first of all, there are just general warding amulets, which apparently people carried around with them back in those days, which could prevent being attacked in the first place. In addition, there's the general rule that a demon can only cause harm to a person if he's alone, as opposed to if there are 2 people, in which case it could appear but not cause harm, or 3 people, in which case it can't appear at all, although there are some exceptions to this rule if the demon happens to be particularly powerful, but yeah, that's that. In one source, it mentions that the wood of the Misa tree, which is Aramaic, and I'm not entirely sure what kind of tree that is, but apparently there is one kind of tree which is wood is harmful for demons. It mentions that this is a kind of tree whose wood is hard, but its shadow is not dangerous, whatever that means. So if that helps you figure out what kind of tree it is, then great. In addition, it goes on to a lengthy explanation about how demons are greatly associated with the concept of pairs and doubles. Hence, it's very dangerous to do anything in pairs or with doubles. For instance, it says that if you drink an even number of glasses, then that could be very dangerous for you. So it says, what should you do if this happens? He should take his right thumb in his left hand and his left thumb in his right hand and say a whole thing where he says in Aramaic, although I don't know if it works in English because I've never had to try it, thank God, but whatever, where he says, you and I are 3. And if he hears a voice say, you and I are 4, which makes a pair, which is very bad, he should respond with, you and I are 5. And if he hears it say, you and I are 6, then he should say, you and I are 7. And it says there was an incident where somebody kept on doing this until he reached 101, and the demon exploded. So I guess that's another strategy you should hold on to. And last but not least, probably the simplest one, is that at some point in the Talmud in Tractate Shabbos, later on, it gets into a discussion about this topic once again, and it just gives a list of certain spells and incantations, you could say, which banish a demon. In fact, I think this would be a good time to actually briefly get into the topic about demons in the Talmud in general. How legitimate are they? Are they an actual thing or just superstition? And these things are just listed to make people feel better about them, or were they an actual concern? Or was it a metaphor for according to some people, bacteria? Or are they actual demons? I don't know. Maybe they are a thing, maybe they aren't. But truth be told, they're not a very relevant topic in Judaism. I'm really cherry-picking the examples here. There's probably one mention of demons every, maybe 3 entire books in the Talmud, so they're very, very uncommon and are not relevant. I just make them kind of, I think, more prevalent than they seem because, like I said, I'm sort of cherry-picking them here, because I personally find them somewhat interesting and enjoyable to discuss. But I hope this isn't too disappointing. They bear basically no relevancy to Judaism whatsoever, as they just aren't relevant and don't have what to do with your day-to-day practice. I guess if you do come across one, then maybe this could be useful, but until then, they aren't too relevant and shouldn't be taken exceptionally seriously. Rabino Gersam. Rabino Gersam was a rabbi of particular note around the year 1000 or so, who instituted a few particular laws for the Jewish people that were accepted universally and are now a part of day-to-day Jewish law, and are actually so accepted to an extent that they're described as if they were given by Mount Sinai. Besides for that, this guy, Rabino Gersam, had a pretty interesting life, apparently helping out and tending to sick people during a plague, and assisting a king with building a replica made of silver of King Solomon's throne. The story goes that he actually had 2 wives, one of which wasn't that great, and conspired with some of the royal court to accuse him of stealing from the funds to make the throne. So he was imprisoned at the top of a tower in the middle of a desert to wait and starve. So his other wife, the good one, came, found him, and tried to help him out. Basically, as per his request, brought a length of rope, a length of thin silk, a beetle, and a worm. So the length of silk was tied to the beetle, and the other end was tied to the rope. And then she let the worm crawl up the tower, and then released the beetle, which began crawling up after the worm, dragging the thin silk thread up after it, up until when it reached the window, wherein Rabino Gersam grabbed the silk thread and pulled it up until he brought up the regular rope, and then climbed down and escaped. It also mentions that the wicked advisor who arranged all of this to begin with, conspiring with his other wife and whatnot, went to check up on him later on and went inside the cell, and was so surprised to see that Rabino Gersam wasn't there that he forgot to keep the door open, at which point it slammed behind him and locked him in. So some of the laws instituted by Rabino Gersam are a complete ban on polygamy, which is why that's no longer a thing. B, stuff in regards to laws of divorce. C, the prohibition to read another person's private mail, among a few others. Pairs of evil. For some reason, as mentioned earlier, pairs are associated with a lot of negative energy, so to speak, in the Talmud. It says that Ashmedai, the king of the demons, is appointed over all pairs. Apparently this one rabbi went and managed to converse with a demon, and the demon told him that if one drinks 2 cups, we try and kill him. If he drinks 4, then we don't try and kill him, but we do harm him, with some variation based on whether it was done intentionally or unintentionally. It mentions later on that if there were a pair of signs placed on a barrel, then that one time caused a barrel to explode. It says that it's dangerous to have 2 eggs, 2 nuts, 2 cucumbers, and some other stuff in pairs, as that could cause harm, apparently. Although, besides for all this, it says that generally speaking, if somebody's particular with all these things in regards to demons, then that's when demons will focus on him and cause issues if he messes up, versus a person who just goes about his life not caring about any of these things, then they just won't pay any attention to him and they won't be an issue. So maybe don't focus on this too much, as it's probably not relevant. As I mentioned earlier also, that demons just aren't a relevant concept and aren't really a thing anymore, so far as we know, that is. Layer 46. The gates of hell. So hell, or Gehenna, is a topic in Judaism which is kind of discussed here and there. It's not particularly relevant due to the nature of hell being somewhat different than it is in other religions. However, in some places it actually gets into the location of hell. In one source it says that it's in outer space, hence me mentioning Warhammer 40k way earlier on in this iceberg. Some other places it seems to imply that it's deep under the ground, although, truth be told, all of it probably is metaphor, and it most definitely is not an actual literal location that if you dig down far enough you'll reach hell. It's probably a spiritual place where your soul goes to. But one of the places which I think is moderately interesting is that it mentions that the gates of hell are 3. There are 3 entrances to Gehenna. One of them is in the wilderness, one of them is in the ocean, and one of them is in Jerusalem. It also mentions one other place, which is that there are these 2 date trees in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and also potentially on somewhere on the mountain of Har HaBarzel. I'm not sure where that is exactly. Also, briefly, it mentions over here all the 7 names of hell, which there are many. There is Sheol, Avadoin, Ve'er Shachas, Var Sha'in, Tit Hayavin, Tzalmaves, and Eretz Hatachtis, which just literally means the underground, but you know. So are there literal, actual gates to hell, like actual like Elder Scrolls Oblivion like style gates to Oblivion in these locations? I don't know. I've never looked. If you see one, please let me know. I'll but, it's probably metaphorical. It also, to be fair, mentions that there are gates to the Garden of Eden, one of which is in Eretz Yisrael, its entrance being in the area of Beis Sha'an, potentially another entrance being in Arabia, its entrance being in Beis Gerim, possibly being between the rivers of Babylonia, and its entrance could possibly be in this area called Dum Saknin. Don't know where that is, but yeah, that's about that. The staff in the stone. This one might actually be my favorite non-story entry in this entire list. It's actually really fascinating, and it's pretty cool how there's so much lore to Moses' staff. Besides for, parting an ocean, doing a few other miracles, apparently it's ancient, being listed by the Talmud as one of the 10 wondrous things created by God at twilight by the first Shabbos of creation. Apparently, it was made out of either sapphire or wood from the tree of knowledge, which is pretty cool, and had engraved onto it the tetragrammaton, which is God's full name, and also the initials in Hebrew, Titzach, Adash, Ba'achav, which is an acronym for the 10 plagues. The commentaries relate that the staff was given to Adam in the Garden of Eden, who passed it on to Enoch, who passed it on to Noah, to Shem, to Abraham, to Yitzchak, to Yaakov, who then brought it to Egypt, who passed it on to his son Yosef, and when Yosef died, the staff was taken by the Pharaoh. Eventually, Yisro, or Jethro, who at that point was one of Pharaoh's advisors, saw the staff and its letters and thought it was pretty cool, so he took it to his house in Midian, where he took it to his house and planted it in the middle of his garden, at which point no one else was able to pull it from the ground. So, much later on, when Moses fled Egypt and came to Midian and ended up marrying one of Yisro's daughters and having Yisro as a father-in-law, he went over to the staff, which had been stuck in the ground for years, no one being able to pull it out, and then promptly pulled it out of the ground, which bears a lot of similarities to the myth of King Arthur, which I guess could maybe mean that that was taken from this whole thing, but yeah, that's the idea. It's pretty cool. Says that also that the staff will ultimately be given to the Messiah during the Messianic era, so that's something to look forward to. As for now, we have no idea what the staff is, and apparently it was hidden away. The mistake of idolatry. There's a pretty interesting belief in Judaism, particularly in regards to idolatry, which was that idolatry wasn't actually some wicked heretical thing to spite God. It was actually a fairly understandable mistake. This is referring to biblical era idolatry, by the way. I don't know that people do modern era idolatry, but if you do, stop that. But besides for that, essentially it states that people actually believed in God. The thing was that they believed that the things which are, so to speak, emissaries of God, things which act as an intermediary between God and everyone else, for instance, say the sun, which, obviously God made the sun and whatnot, and the sun thereby gives life and causes plants to grow and does all sorts of great things for us here on this world. So the sun, in a sense, is an intermediary of God, and this applies to most things that people did with idolatry, because the mistake that they made was that they believed that while God exists and he's cool and all that, it would be much more effective to just pray to the intermediary forthright and not have to go straight to the guy at the top, instead just pray to the guy who's directly giving us stuff, which is of course a bit of a foolish belief. It'd be like, I don't know, paying a waiter an extra sum of money because you're so thankful for the food he gives, because obviously these things like the sun, moon, and stars and whatever else they were praying to don't have any will of their own. It's just as explained like in axe in the hands of a woodsman. The axe doesn't decide what it's going to cut, it just goes wherever the woodsman swings it. So too with the higher spheres and whatever God's running. So by that regard, idolatry was more of just a foolish mistake than anything else. Water reflections and love. So there's a very important thing in the Tanya and concepts in Chassidus, which is about the importance of having a level of love and awe towards God. It's a whole topic. It's like one of the most discussed things in the entirety of the Tanya. In fact, it describes that when you do commandments with love and fear, they're like wings which attach to the commandment and ascend it towards the highest spiritual levels. Thing is, it gets into a bit of a discussion about how to actually feel a level of love towards God, because you can't just command somebody to love something. That's not how that works. You actually have to have that feeling from within. So one of the topics it brings up is the idea of reflections of water and how it relates to love. It says, quoting a verse, that the same way water reflects another thing, that's the same way that love functions, which is obviously a concept the same way that if somebody loves you, you will immediately want to feel a sense of love towards them. And if you love somebody else, then they will probably love you in return. And somebody who loves others will generally in turn be loved. So clearly love is something which reflects, once again, compared to water. So it explains basically, as is known, that of course as God has this great love for the Jewish people, thereby this love should too be reflected in you. And this applies obviously as one would have love reflected for another person. How much more so if, like, say, as it explains, a king loved you, who is a much lower person than a king, obviously you would have that love reflected back towards them, and how much more so if it's literally God. So that's a pretty important concept, and there you go. Layer 47, Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh is the concept that for a Jewish person, when push comes to shove, so to speak, they will generally give up their lives for the sake of God and refuse to give up their religion, generally even if they had nothing what to do with their religion previously. And this is explained because you have a godly soul, which of course is connected to God. So therefore, even if you don't feel your Judaism at all, or have anything to do with it, or care about God in the slightest, or even believe in him, when it finally comes down to it, for instance, say in the Crusades, or the Holocaust, or the Roman exile, or the Babylonian exile, or the time of Haman, or during, say, communist Russia, or in any of these situations when the Jewish people have been dealing with these kind of shenanigans, people will always refuse to give up their Judaism and instead often give up their lives for God, which is a nice concept, and let's hope we don't need to deal with that ever again. The quickest track to Mashiach. So Mashiach is brought up very, very often throughout Judaism and on this chart because it's very important, and especially towards the lower levels, as now we're getting into some of the more esoteric things. But as is known and is cited very often in the Talmud, that the second temple, which was the last temple, was destroyed because of hatred between Jewish people. And hatred between Jewish people on top of a very bad thing is particularly detested by God. So it says that in order to build the third temple with the coming of Mashiach, probably the fastest and simplest track to get this done is through being kind and loving one another, as it says that the second temple was destroyed through having hatred between one another, and the third temple will be rebuilt through having love between one another. So, in short, just be good to each other. The War of Persia and Rome. Persia and Rome are both very important countries throughout the Torah and the Talmud. They're explained to be not just literally Persia and the Roman Empire, but actually their ideologies and people, which, as said in the Talmud, are the only two peoples which will basically last forever, as opposed to the other ones, like, say, the Babylonians. These two peoples are supposed to be eternal. And in addition, it says before the coming of Mashiach, apparently at some point, very briefly beforehand, these two countries are supposed to kind of go to war with one another. Now, most people agree that the modern equivalent of Persia is Iran and that general region, and of course the modern equivalent of Edom or Rome is the United States, which I'm not saying is a bad thing at all. I actually love the United States, best country, but point is, it says that towards the end times may have some significance in relation to the war of Gog and Magog, that these two countries will go to war with one another, which will herald in and somehow the coming of Mashiach. So I guess that's something to look out for. The fox on the Temple Mount. Long after the temple was destroyed, it says that Rabbi Akiva, who is mentioned once again quite a few times, and a few other rabbis decided to travel back to Jerusalem and its ruins, which was a pretty sad experience because this was the very start of an exile which would last for a few thousand years. It says when they arrived at Mount Scopus and saw the site of the temple, they rent their garments, and when they arrived at the Temple Mount, they saw a fox that emerged from the site of the Holy of Holies. So the rabbis began weeping, however Rabbi Akiva began laughing. So they asked him, "Why are you laughing?" So he responded by saying that there are these two verses in the Torah which are linked, both of which contain two prophecies, the prophecy of Uriah and the prophecy of Zechariah, one of which speaks about the destruction of the second temple, and the third speaks about the coming of Mashiach. So it says that up until this point, Rabbi Akiva hadn't been certain about the prophecy of the coming of Mashiach coming true. But now that the destruction of Jerusalem and the second temple had occurred, it was a given that one day the third temple would be rebuilt with the coming of Mashiach. So the book of the Talmud ends with the rabbis responding to him, "Akiva, you have comforted us." Layer 48. The prophecy of Daniel. The Book of Daniel is one of the strangest books in the Torah. It starts off pretty ordinarily, dealing with the events of the prophet Daniel and the situation after the destruction of the first temple with Nebuchadnezzar. But then, at the very end, it sort of descends into this whole chaos of dreams and prophecy and esoteric symbolism, and basically nobody has any idea what it means. At the very end, it speaks of a prophecy by the coming of Mashiach, a prophecy which speaks of a king in the north and a king of the south who will go to war against one another. It speaks about countries that will be destroyed, countries that will be spared. It basically dictates the story of an incoming great war that will happen one day in the future in very vague terms, with very vague terminologies to reference certain countries. There was a few previous wars that were mentioned earlier in the Book of Daniel, which are generally attributed pretty precisely to some of the later wars of the times of the Romans and the Greeks. However, this one last battle, which is attributed to refer to the coming of Mashiach and is said to happen right before the end times, we basically have no idea what it's referring to. It ends off by saying that then Mashiach will come and that the resurrection of the dead will occur, and says, quote, that the knowledgeable will be radiant like the bright expanse of sky, and those who led the many to righteousness will be like the stars forever and ever. But it says then that you, Daniel, should keep the word secret and seal the book until the time of the end. Finally, it ends off with Daniel asking the angel who's telling him all these things, when will this thing occur? And the angel responds, for a time, times, and half a time, and when the breaking of the power of the holy people comes to an end, then shall all these things be fulfilled. Then it also lists a few dates, which we have no idea what those mean either, and then it says that you should go and rest and you'll be awoken by the time of Mashiach. So, what does any of this mean? Nobody has any idea. There has been attempts to interpret this time and time again, and they keep on failing. It specifically says in the Talmud that anybody who attempts to predict this or try to figure out what's going on here will fail, and it's also a very bad thing to try to do. Instead, the general idea seems to be that you should try to bring Mashiach through your own action, and this Book of Daniel, it says what it actually means will be revealed when the time comes. So, maybe look into it if you care to, but I don't think you'll get very far. You cannot begin to understand God. This is sort of referencing a concept in Kabbalah, which is that of Seder Hishtalshelus, which basically means the chain descent of the creation of the world. And what it's getting at here is that basically you really cannot begin to even fathom what God is. Like, whatever you think God is, it's kind of explained that what most people envision, if they don't study these more esoteric Kabbalistic things, what most people envision when they think of God is kind of like the lowest levels of God in this whole concept. In fact, there is an idea at the very, very top called the Ein Sof, which literally means the light without end, or the infinite light, or something like that. And basically what it refers to is, up until this point, we just can't define what God is anymore. He's so infinite and incomprehensible that you cannot even begin to separate one level from the other, because it would be too impossible to understand. In fact, the God that most people think of when they think of God is actually some of the lower levels. Rather, God is actually more of this thing, I guess, which has existed since before time and will exist eternally after time, and is infinite, and any attempt at giving any definition at all is in a sense limiting it. He simultaneously exists within everything and beyond everything, and is constantly recreating all of the universe at every single point in time, always. Which isn't just the universe, but, every single atom within the entire universe. All the while simultaneously providing individual focus and assistance towards everything that exists ever. And all that's just sort of a simplified explanation. Point is that God is a lot more incomprehensible than you'd think he is, and that sort of makes it all the greater that he decides to deal with us. But, here we are. Layer 49. Quest for the Luminary. This is a concept which is written about in the very last thing which was given out by the Lubavitcher Rebbe before his passing, in the teaching of the Atan. Basically, it explains about the importance of how, generally, when the Jewish people are struggling, that's when people particularly do the best and turn to God and pray and try their hardest to bring Mashiach, mostly because things aren't great. But it's particularly important even when times are good, and easy to have this level of effort, and even though your life might seem nice, it's still vitally important to make effort into bringing mashiach. This whole concept is called Crushed for the Luminary because it's based on a whole verse from the Torah which speaks about the lighting of the menorah, but yeah, that's that, and I think it's a very important thing, as do most religious Jewish people. The most important world. So as referenced earlier in this concept called Seder Hishtalshelus, which is the chain descent of creation, which is basically that there are a bunch of worlds and spiritual concepts which slowly facilitate in having God and his light and energies descend from the higher realms into the lower spiritual realms in this Kabbalistic idea. Basically, our world is the lowest, and there are a bunch of worlds and layers above us. So the point is that generally speaking, when you have a whole system where everything is designed to funnel down to the lowest possible thing, that lowest possible thing is the purpose and result of everything, hence that lowest possible world is the purpose of all those higher things. So it essentially states that even though our world is the lowest and least spiritual, it actually is the most important world, as the entirety of existence and all these higher spiritual spheres exist solely for the purpose of facilitating the existence of this lowest world. Layer 50. When will Mashiach come? Well, this one kind of had to be the lowest thing on this entire iceberg, and the last, because it goes in order as to what's least and most unknown, and of course the thing which nobody knows precisely is when Mashiach precisely will come. It says by Yaakov, the forefather, that he actually knew, and when he tried to relate it to his kids right before his passing, he immediately just had his memory wiped and completely forgot about it. It says all throughout the Talmud that anybody who tries to figure it out and analyze texts of the Torah which speak about in vague allegory towards the time will be unsuccessful. So far as I know, there isn't a single thing in the entire Torah which tells the exact time of Mashiach's arrival. Most people do, however, seem to agree that it'll be soon, very soon. In fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe states that it will be during this generation, the 7th generation, which is the people alive today, presumably, who will bring Mashiach, which is actually a fairly new thing because Mashiach wasn't really such a relevant topic in the past few hundred years. It only became recently prevalently spoken about in the past maybe 50 to 100 odd years, and recently, of course, when it suddenly became of particular significance and people began agreeing that it's going to be basically any day now. Well, the world is changing very fast constantly, much more than it did in years prior. Some might even say towards messianic concepts such as the mass propagation of knowledge throughout the entire world, and countries making serious efforts to try to decrease war and, so to speak, beating their swords into plowshares, as the verse goes. So when will Mashiach come? We don't know, but soon, I hope. I think all we need to do is just a little bit more. And with that said, that is the end of the Judaism iceberg chart. This has been a lot of layers and a lot of concepts. I hope you've somehow stuck with me throughout this entire way. Once again, if you've seen the previous 6 videos, then make sure to check those out to get the whole thing. This has just been the bottommost layer. But with that said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. And with that said, have a great night.